Hi folks, I'm joined by the founder and director of Forum for Democracy, Thierry Baudet. I pronounced that wrong, haven't I?
No, it's almost right.
Almost right. And John Laughland. Thank you both for joining me. I thought, would be able to discuss what you guys are actually doing, because I think that a lot of our audience will have heard your names in the press and read your Wikipedia bios, which are not flattering, but it was enough to make me like you. Because basically I get the same description on Wikipedia as well. So I was like, right, okay, they can't be that bad. And I thought we'd just talk about the current circumstance in which you find yourself and what you think is going on.
Yes, well, thank you for having us. We're sort of touring podcasts together. I'm a member of parliament. I'm a Dutch politician in the Netherlands. And I've written a book which is now coming out in English, The COVID Conspiracy, the Globalist Takeover and the Great Reset, which is about what I think is currently happening. And our party, my party, has an international department, which is called Forum for Democracy International. And we are very, very honored that John Laughland has agreed to be the director of that institute. I've been an admirer of John's for a very long time, for many, many years. And together we're trying to build an international platform for like-minded people. And if you need an umbrella term for that, I would say we are a global anti-globalist alliance.
Is this like a counter World Economic Forum?
Right. Well, yes, in a way you could say most of the ideas that we oppose are defended by the World Economic Forum. So it's almost an exact thing. If you take anything they propose, then you're almost entirely sure that we will believe the opposite. This would be right for society.
I basically find myself in the same position at this point, because I mean it doesn't seem to be overstating the case that there is some kind of global takeover by a particular cabal of people who all share a particular worldview, which seems to be a kind of managerial view of humanity, of what humanity should live under. And as someone who has been quite independent my entire life, I find myself viewing it with a great deal of horror, actually. What do you guys make of that?
Well, managerial is the right word, because the history of the World Economic Forum, as I'm sure you know, is that it was created in 1971, I think, as the European Management Forum, and Klaus Schwab is in fact a professor of management, and so he indeed ticks all the wrong boxes, because he is a managerist. He is the embodiment of James Burnham's managerial revolution. And I think the reason why we are, the opposite of the World Economic Forum is the thing, probably to summarize, the thing that we hate most about it is this conjunction of big business, big corporate business, and leftism. In Britain and in other countries for many decades now, the right has allied itself with world capitalism, international capitalism. But I'm afraid, in my view, the right has chosen the wrong ally, because on the contrary, as we've seen only recently here in Britain with Nigel Farage's the cancellation of his bank account, we can see that big business, big banks, big corporations have become left-wing organizations, culturally left-wing organizations. So it's this drift of liberalism, or what pretends to be liberalism, towards the left, which the World Economic Forum embodies, I think, more than anything else.
I hate to say it, but I think it's not even what appears to be liberalism. I think it is, yes. It's kind of inevitable.
Well,
that liberalism
but I mean, yes, I agree. I like you. I think it does actually come from liberalism itself. But on the other hand, we are now in a world where there is no rule of law, where property rights are, severely curtailed, if not completely destroyed, where there isn't really freedom of speech. So all those basic building blocks of classical liberalism have of course, in the recent developments, been brushed aside.
Why do you think that is?
Well, I think it is because liberalism is it is indeed in the actual essence of liberalism itself, which set itself up in the 17th century as a neutral structure. It would take Hobbes, the idea was the state would prevent conflict and so on. And then later on it was the market or the law, or these so-called neutral structures which were supposed to dissipate away social conflict. In reality, all declensions of liberalism are progressivist, and they want to improve society, to create a new man, and so on. And so they can never let up. They're always seeking new dragons to slay. It's not a neutral system, liberalism. It's, on the contrary, a militant system. And that's why the programmatic book of late 20th or mid 20th century liberalism is called The Open Society and Its Enemies. And indeed, liberalism, I think, defines itself, in some ways I sometimes say a bit like Protestantism, only in terms of its enemies. And that's why it's constantly seeking new enemies to justify its own sense of progressivism.
It is interesting, isn't it, how it has this unspoken doctrine that allows it to render everything in reality as being in some way problematic, and progress is to break down all of these things. What do you think the end state of progress looks like? What's the destination?
There isn't an end state. That's the whole point. It is a constant revolution. It's a permanent revolution, because unless there are more and more enemies to find, then liberalism loses its purpose. That's why it keeps creating new enemies. That's why, so to take an example of wokeism, gay marriage came out of nowhere about 10 years, just slightly less than 10 years ago. Nobody expected the gay marriage thing suddenly to come onto the agenda, still less for it to be a totem for progressivism, because those countries that don't accept it are pilloried. And then hardly was that over, but now we have transgender, which is seems to be another madness. So I don't know what the next thing will be. Maybe the sexualization of children and the normalization of paedophilia. But what I am certain of is that it's a constant process because of this desire for progressivism. It's essentially a progressive obsession. And it's the opposite of the conservative mindset, which is to regard reality as a source of wonderment, a source of inspiration, and of something which may lead to improvement, but also we all know that, man is fallen in nature, and that fundamentally human nature will always remain the same.
I'd like to advance a theory as to what I think the end state is of progressivism. I think that the problem with liberalism is essentially the fetishization of reason, and the raising of this to levels of essentially a divine quality,
yes,
which renders the human body the issue itself. Because, of course, a man's will and reason are trapped within his own skull, which is attached to the rest of his corporeal form. And this leads them to find everything about material reality to actually be the problem.
Absolutely.
And therefore, everything becomes subject to the whims of a person's, just desires and will.
Yes.
And this means that essentially what they're trying to do is liberate themselves from their own bodies.
Absolutely. Well, that's the
reality itself.
That's the Gnosticism that Vogelin talked about, which we see in the transgender movement, but what we see also in all the attempts to plan society. As you say, the fetishization of reason, or perhaps more precisely of will.
Well, I should have.
Because reason, after all, it's a tool to look at the world and to understand it, and so on.
Yeah, but no, I think you're absolutely right. But this, I'm glad you said it's a kind of Gnostic philosophy, because there are huge amounts of metaphysics attached to the idea that actually the will isn't the product of the body, which is ironic considering these people are all materialists. They don't have any theological views whatsoever, and yet it's all buried underneath the layer of materialism, and they can never really be honest about their own beliefs, can they?
Yeah, there are many contradictions. One of the things that strikes me most about the transgender movement, which you might think had come out of the 1960s and free love and so on, is that actually the transgender movement is not about sex. Because if you have a sex change operation, you can't have sex, as a matter of fact. So it's a very peculiar development. In fact, it's a dialectical opposite of the place where it started. But I think that's part, I think this dialectical thing where one thing and its opposite can, as it were, both be true, is part of this cyclical and very destructive process of progressivism.
The issue I think that modern conservatives have is that A, I don't think they have this kind of level of understanding of what's happening, but B, they're also kind of married to liberalism because in prior eras it seemed like a good idea and it didn't have this Gnostic seed of destruction as far as they could tell, and so it seemed perfectly reasonable to say, well, we want constitutional rights, we'd like free speech, we'd like all of these things, and now they're committed to a path that seems to lead to inevitable destruction of everything, not just our own societies, but in the sanctity of the human body. What foundations should conservatives be taking instead of the liberal foundations that they're on at the moment? Where should they begin from, really, do you think?
I think you said it quite well, that the biological reality of life is essential. And that also pertains, obviously, to the great taboos regarding the immigration discussion. We are not allowed to talk about ethnicity. We're not allowed to talk about biology. This is the central taboo. And conservatives have accepted not merely the mindset of the liberal, the vocabulary, but also the taboos of the liberals. And it's my view that taboos are protectors, guarantors of an order, political order. And so as long as conservatives continue to be scared of these taboos and of being named all the swear words that surround the taboos, racist, fascist, anti-Semite, homo-hater, COVID denier, climate denier, all these things, as long as they go to great lengths to avoid being labeled such, they will never come back to their actual beliefs and feel confident about them.
And in fact, that seems to be exactly the purpose of all of these smears.
Sure, they intend to incite fear into people, and the consequence is that they will sort of accept something. And there was just one more thing that I wanted to add. You mentioned the philosophical origins of liberalism, 17th century, all these things. I understand that, and I agree partly, but I also think that the liberal movement used classical freedom rights, like freedom of speech, to destroy an order. It was this comes from the French Revolution, where they essentially wanted to do away with, let's say, the church as an institution, and also aristocracy and a few other institutions, national states, national identities came later, and so they start using these rights as offensive weapons, and conservatives, being perhaps naive in this, they're like, okay, that's very good to have free debate, to have diversity. They are not interested in free debate. They are not interested in diversity. They are interested in using the pretext of diversity to destroy something. For example, to destroy sexual relations between man and woman and families and so on. That's why they promote this transgenderism, not because they're genuinely open-minded, but because they genuinely want diversity. They are insincere. And conservatives, I think, have been counting too much on the sincerity of their opponents. The left never plays by their own rules. They always change the rules halfway through. And so conservatives resemble, I think very much, the Achilles in the famous metaphor of Achilles and the toad, or the turtle in English. So Achilles thinks that he is in a certain play field, but once he arrives at the point where he intends to catch the turtle has already sort of dribbled away, and Achilles just can't get his mind around to what is happening, that he's always losing. But this is the story of conservatives for the past 200 years. They thought they had adapted to the new rules of the game, but once they had come to the battlefield, like with their gear and everything, all right, let's have this battle, it had already shifted.
I completely agree.
Too late.
Weirdly, it's very much like upgrading Windows. Yeah. I've never accepted a Windows upgrade, and yet I'm on Windows 10 now. I started on Windows 3.5, and somehow I've already arrived at Windows 10, but I never agreed to any of this. And this is what the modern conservative feels like. It's like, well, I didn't agree to any of this, but now we're transitioning children. And this is a real issue. And one thing I think you were sort of hinting at it is the lack of normative component within liberalism prevents them from actually having something that gives them a boundary or place of guidance. And so we're constantly relying on some kind of presupposed normative instruction that's never articulated. And for some reason, conservatives have left this totally untouched. What are you for, not what are you against, as you were saying. It's insanely frustrating, isn't it?
Well, again, I think that's because liberals are not interested in truth. And that's why I think yes, I know what you mean by the fetishization of reason, but conservatives surely should be interested in truth. They should be interested in trying to understand, in using their reason to understand the world as it is. Liberals, and that's also the paradox about materialism, because the key thing about materialism is that it is matter is unformed. So therefore, the consequence of materialism is that it can be informed by a simple act of will. In other words, the world, human nature, society is infinitely malleable by pure arbitrary decision making.
Sorry to interrupt. It seems that actually, the way that you've framed this, it reveals liberalism to have a problem with truth itself, as in the enemy is the truth of reality. We need to change that because I have a feeling, I have a desire.
I agree.
To have something
yes,
different.
because reality is not appreciated, and it is instead, that comes back to the Gnostic thing. The liberal, or the Gnostic anyway, is angry with reality. Is angry at the world, at the way the world is now, and he wants to change it. So his attitude is one of constant change for change's sake. And the search for truth, by contrast, and the putting forward of truth, in as much as we can come to have access to the truth, is also, secondarily, one of the instruments against taboos, because it's precisely in societies where faith and truth, or a faith and a belief in truth, have collapsed, that people instead navigate by taboos. And in today's societies, that is the problem. Most people today navigate almost like animals. They sort of in the night or whatever. They can sense where a taboo is, and they shift according to it, rather than trying to understand what may or may not be true and going for that truth.
And ironically, this turns into a kind of tradition of its own, doesn't it? Because without an actual, because one of the things, of course, the liberals are deeply against is the concept of tradition, because in the sort of Burkean way that prejudice is built up as a habitual knowledge that's unspoken about what is right and wrong, the liberal order now is actually building up their own set of unspoken but well-known taboos, and so they're becoming the thing that they sought to overthrow anyway.
Yes, but tradition is indeed only an instrument in the Burkean logic. It's just because something is traditional is not itself. It is, on the contrary, it is a reservoir of truth. That's Burke's view, rather like Hayek with the market.
Sorry, I should have framed it as a kind of anti-tradition, shouldn't I, or a sort of negative image of tradition, something like that. But so, on the subject of tradition, then. How do you think we can best make the argument for these traditions in the modern era? Because, I mean, well-educated gentlemen such as yourself, of course, understand and appreciate the importance of them. But there are many young people today who I feel have been deliberately disconnected from the traditions of their countries. How do we try and persuade them that maybe there's something here they should be interested in?
Well, the thing that John said about how the movement of free love in the 60s turned into something that has nothing to do with love or sex anymore right now, I think that makes a more fundamental point. Conservatives or traditionalists love the thing that has been created and that serves a certain purpose, and they look at life on the bright side. They see something that presents a certain enjoyment or a certain pleasure to people. Exactly. And the liberal, being a revolutionary, being an activist, being an unpleasant person, will not feel that. So if you are, and will look at it from some kind of abstract perspective in which it creates an inequality or some other perceived injustice or privilege or whatever. So he has his arguments ready. It's unjust. We have to change it. But the thing that the traditionalist has to present in opposite is how much it actually gives, this perceived inequality, privilege, whatever. And that is something that can be, I think, that can be passed on to the new generation. I've just become a father.
Congratulations.
I have a son. His name is Lancelot. And obviously I would love him to understand some of the myths and the great stories that surround that personality in European history. But all the things that I'm trying to pass on to him are things that I actually love.
Exactly.
Culinary traditions, musical traditions, a certain understanding of the interior design of the home with paintings, with those kind of things, and that is something that and beauty that is a friend that we will always have on our side. Liberals cannot create beautiful things.
No,
it's impossible.
True. It's completely true.
Inimical to their very existence. There was even this is a very interesting point that there was a huge study, an empirical study, based on the faces of thousands and thousands of people and their political view. I'm sure you've seen it. It was on the internet.
I haven't seen it, but I can guess where this is going.
So the more this is actually factual. This is I'm not saying
science.
It's
science.
I'm quoting science, and since we are here in the absolutization of science, whenever it's scientifically proven, I mean there's consensus. There's scientific consensus. 97% of all scientists agree that the more beautiful someone is perceived like sociological, the more classically beautiful facial characteristics and so on, the more likely they are to be right-wing.
It's demonstrated in every person's experience.
Right. So if you see a beautiful girl with high energy, she's likely to hold conservative views, to be more conservative in her understanding of the world, and that. But of course, traditionalists, conservatives, people generally speaking on our side of the spectrum, have been extremely shy to point out all these things, and they've let themselves be reduced to a sort of dhimmi status where they're afraid of themselves to speak out and to be openly to. They always have been fighting with their right hand tied to their back, because otherwise you're this, you're that. Oh no. I mean, I'm sure people would perceive it as extremely sexist, what I've just said. The more beautiful women are, the more likely they are to be right-wing. Whereas this is now not something that I'm saying. This is not me. I'm just quoting a huge study that was undertaken.
But even then, isn't like I'm at the point where I'm a little bit unrepentant anymore of
being called sexist,
of being of saying something true.
Yeah.
And being critiqued by a progressive.
No, but I'm not saying it because I'm afraid of being that. I'm just I'm explaining the way the debate works.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
But this is something that's very much frustrated me because essentially what the conservative wants is the antithesis of what the liberal wants in every case, and it's that way because the liberal is trying to destroy the conservatives. The institutions the conservative wants, and so it frustrates me that the conservatives never make an argument for something like exclusivity, for example. Exclusivity is actually the easiest thing in the world to defend because something that is ultimately inclusive has to be available to everyone and therefore has zero value because everyone has access to it.
Yeah, but this is another thing that everyone is conservative regarding the things that they love.
Yes.
So this is another point with regards to exclusivity. The people arguing for the most economic egalitarianism or whatever, the inclusivity or show me your bank account.
Yes.
So this is another thing that I think conservatives have not done enough, which is pointing to the hypocrisy of the left. And we've seen this with the climate conferences. All these people flying in with their private jets to tell us that we're not allowed to eat meat anymore. Come on, and this is across the board. You'll see that everywhere. Show me a liberal, and I'll show you a hypocrite.
I agree with you, but the problem is you made the point earlier that the liberal will just change the boundaries.
Yes,
and so they're immune to charges of hypocrisy. They don't care.
They are, but the general public,
absolutely,
and also our own ranks, because this is the third thing that I've witnessed during my life in politics and all these debates and things I've done. There are so few people that are willing to stand up to right-wing defenders of their ideas. Whereas the left is always clotting together. I was the only elected politician in Europe to defend Andrew Tate's ridiculous arrest, and the entire situation surrounding him and his brother in Romania is absurd. From a legal perspective, from a due process perspective, from a political perspective, I have not seen massive support for Nigel Farage when he was debanked recently. Why aren't we standing up for each other?
Well, there actually was quite a lot of defence for Farage in Britain, actually, which was very unusual.
So I take that back. But it's an unusual thing, yeah.
I don't blame you for not seeing it, because it wasn't exactly widely publicised in the media. But many Conservative politicians actually did come out in his defence. Of course, the media didn't want to make that known, because, of course, that makes the right look like it might have some sort of unity. Legitimacy. As in, hang on, they have a moral point here that we actually can't really argue, because if we're for ultimate inclusivity, taking someone's bank account away from them sounds a lot like they're violating their human rights, right? And so, of course, this is something they kind of shied away on. But I agree with you. We should be a lot more vocal, and this is why it frustrates me that Conservatives are actually quite tepid in their arguments. Like exclusivity, like I was saying, is a really easy thing to defend. Actually, no, the people who don't deserve and haven't earned the thing that I have or I'm protecting don't deserve to have any access to it at all. And you agree with that in every case because you exclude racism. You exclude the people you consider to be racist. So you already agree with me that you want to create a particular space that actually has a certain constituency that has access to it. So now we're speaking in the same language and you already are on my side. So don't give me, but I mean, then I'd have to call them a hypocrite. And I've just argued that they don't care about that, haven't I? So maybe that doesn't matter. but there are other things that the right needs to be a lot more aggressive on, really, aren't they?
And positive. I mean, you've just denounced the word exclusive in its negative use. So you're excluding racism and so on. But we all know that exclusive also has a positive, a very, very positive connotation. Exclusive offer, exclusive hotel or whatever.
It's incredibly positive.
Same with the word discrimination. He's a very discriminating man. It doesn't mean he's a prejudiced man. It means that, on the contrary, he has a lot of taste and knows how to judge the good from the bad.
He has discernment.
Exactly. Yeah. So aggressive, yes, no doubt. Certainly robust, but also positive.
And finally, we lack massive donors like George Soros and so on. And that is another thing that I've wondered about for many years. How come? Where are our billionaires? And the billionaires that there are more or less on the conservative side seem to be extremely concerned with being associated with the forbidden things, and they want the New York Times to write something, or they prefer to go to the gala of the New York Times than to be with some activist group. So they're not there, and part of that is obviously fear for the other financial institutions that they themselves are dependent on again, because if you're a billionaire, you're very afraid that the tax authorities are going to come and knock on your door. Obviously, you're very afraid of. There are lots of closets that you'd like to keep closed, but also, I think we have not successfully created a social and economic network yet. We are still dependent very much on. So that's why I've launched an app on my phone, on the iPhone. There's a forum app. The party has launched it. We're going to internationalize that. And all the members of the party can put their companies on it. They can have job offers, holiday houses. We've set up a school. We set up a publishing house, obviously. And we have a dating function on it, so that you can Tinder your way through conservative people, and we can do that on a global level. I mean, if this anti-globalist alliance really takes off, and we have a global app where we can always find, if I have a problem with my car or I want to find a restaurant or something, that's another thing that we have not yet established, whereas the left, I think, has been much more successful in that regard, in creating social and economic
they're ruthless.
connections.
They're ruthless. They will exclude anything they perceive as being non-leftist, let alone being conservative, at the drop of the hat. And they're very, very conscious of where funds are going. And they make sure they go to left-wing causes all the time. They're incredibly well organized.
Yes, and this is an example from the Netherlands. So the government, we have now formally a right-wing government. That means that they have been campaigning on not paying too much to the climate policies. Yeah. So with this government, they give subsidies, several millions, to this organization, activist lobbyist organization called Urgenda. And they start a lawsuit against the government with the money provided for them by the government to demand more climate policies. And then the government decides not to proceed against them, just to accept the judgment of the judge. But if you do that in Dutch private law, you're very likely to lose the case, because if you don't put forward arguments, the judge is not going to investigate himself, right, or herself, in most cases now. And so the government got ruled against, did not appeal, went to parliament, like, it's a judge, it's not our opinion, it's the rule of law, we have to do this. And that is it's a way to use money to channel this and to get the whole government to move very steeply in the left direction. And that is something that, for example, people on our side are never thinking about those tricks.
The Conservative government over here has been doing much the same thing, actually. They've got they recently decided they weren't going to continue funding Stonewall, the gay activist movement, which is obviously an incredibly left-wing thing. And that was about 6 months ago, after 13 years of Conservative government. So 13 years of Conservative government funding to left-wing activists. And finally they were like, well, maybe we'll stop that. So this is ridiculous. Why was it not on day one? Why do you, the Conservatives, give a single penny to anything that even smells vaguely left-wing? Why aren't you funding right-wing organisations? Why is this the case? And so the Conservatives...
Well, of course, we're already being funded by Putin.
Oh, God. Well, I'm waiting for the check to clear. I mean...
And we just got banned from YouTube.
But you are right. There's no funding for right-wing organisations or initiatives. I mean, I had to fund all of this myself, right? So there's just nothing. And I mean, thank God the public are conservative in quite right-wing and willing to put their money where their mouth is. Because if it wasn't for popular funding, we'd have nothing. And they don't have any popular support whatsoever, do they? So it's incredible.
They have subsidies.
Yeah, they have subsidies from vested interests.
But this is now actually destroying Dutch cultural life as well, because lots of friends of mine are in music and classical music world, and all these orchestras. And this is a field where I believe it's true that subsidies must exist, because otherwise you probably cannot survive. So they have all these subsidies, and as long as subsidies exist, in any case, there's no real market. So it's impossible to go beyond the subsidies in the classical music world. But they have all these demands that your orchestra consists of a certain ethnic minimal population, that you play diverse music. And I know there's lots of other musical traditions, but we have Mozart, Brahms. Come on, this is you're not going to have a classical orchestra do some African music and then Brazilian music and then a Mozart symphony. That's ridiculous. So, but these are all the demands. So it completely destroys musical life, and it also scares away the public from these concerts. So a conservative tradition is effectively destroyed from both sides. The audience is like, oh, whatever, it's weird. The orchestras can't function anymore. And this is how, through these subsidies for diversity, you can effectively destroy entire parts of society.
And they never think about the consequence of this, because I mean, as an Englishman, if I go to the Netherlands and go to watch and listen to an orchestra, I actually don't want to hear African music. I would actually like to hear Dutch music. Weirdly enough,
or just
that's
European
why I've
music.
gone. Or European music more generally. Say, that's why I've gone there. And if I did want to hear African music, I would take a trip to Africa because I'd want the authentic experience, rather than some kind of progressive facsimile. I would actually like to hear Africans playing their music, or Brazilians playing their music, or Europeans playing their music. I'd like to experience the authentic thing. And they, again, have just created this reality where it's not true. There's a disconnect. There's an emotional authenticity when Africans are performing their own indigenous music as to when Europeans are performing their own indigenous music. And there's a truth there that's been removed when the Dutch Philharmonic Orchestra or something is playing something from Zimbabwe or something. It's not real. And I don't believe it. And so I can't get invested in it as a member of the audience, as someone who's interested culturally in that thing.
Yeah, I think it's now also being done with plays, theater plays, and movies, where there's this idea that Hamlet is now a trans woman from immigrant descent or something. It must be like that, otherwise your diversity quota are not going to be met. And I just hope that this will succumb under its own, it will fall apart under its own ridiculousness.
Well, you would think that, but the powers that be seem to be insistent on propping this up. I thought it was going to fall apart a few years ago, but it just keeps going. And now, and the worst part is, I'm really concerned because people of sort of my age and older, we've got a...
You are 25.
I wish I was 25. I'm 43. I remember a time when our cultures were quite self-confident. Right? In the 80s and 90s, we actually liked ourselves, and we actually believed in ourselves, and we didn't see ourselves as being oppressive forces that were keeping the rest of the world down. Actually, we were quite happy with the cultures that we were. And so I at least can remember a time when it wasn't straight white European men are the worst things to have ever walked the earth, right? But now, if you're 21, you don't remember that time.
No.
You only remember the progressive era where, the West has always been evil. And so you have an emotional aversion to connecting with that thing. And you exist in a time where technology is unbelievable and gives you access to everything at all times. And so you've got a short attention span. You don't feel like you belong anywhere. You feel like a kind of stranger, like a leaf that's floating in a river. That you've got no agency and you don't have any stability. And this, I think, I've got young children as well, and I'm genuinely concerned that they're going to grow up feeling they don't actually belong in England, where they've been born and raised their entire lives, that they don't understand, the place. And I'm really worried about this. And this is the sort of thing that I think conservatives should actually start thinking in a more sort of aesthetic way about their own country, rather than in the sort of rationalistic way that the left always presents every argument in the abstract. It's like, no, how do you feel when you're walking through the countryside? How do you feel when you go to an old pub, or you go to an old church, or something like this? You see a castle. This has been here for a long time, and we have been here for a long time. We're rooted people. We're tribes of the land.
You take them to museums and you look at 400 or 500-year-old paintings, and you tell your kid, you look like this person. You look like this king. You're of the same tribe. You are of the same family. That is gone from the modern world. And John and I were walking in Marlborough earlier today, because we were visiting here. We had a car. Beautiful old village, obviously, but then the church in the center of High Street is now a modern art museum with rock music playing from speakers, and it was sort of a dreadful experience. Why? Come on! And this desacralization is of our traditional landscape, but also of our spiritual is everywhere. In the Netherlands, also our traditional festive days are being cancelled or changed, or because they're
not being changed into pride festivals, are they?
Yes, well, for example, we have Dutch Santa Claus is on December 5th.
Right.
It's a typical sort of saint person with a long beard, looks like Santa Claus, but has a slightly different name. His name is Sinterklaas in Dutch. And he has all these black Pete's that are his helpers.
Yeah.
And in the traditional story, they are not slaves because the Netherlands has never had black slavery on its own territory, on its own soil. We've never had that in our entire history. So it's not an innate part of our culture. It's not sort of American Confederate flag kind of thing. That's not what it used to be. But it has sort of been cultural appropriation. We've sort of appropriated that culture and now recreated a Dutch history where we were having slaves here in Amsterdam and in The Hague. It's never happened. We've never had black slaves on Dutch soil in Europe. It has not happened. So it's a different story. The Black Pete is a very funny character.
Yeah.
He's not a slave. He's rather like like Caliban in Shakespeare's The Tempest, where Prospero finds this wild figure and he's sort of his friend and they help each other.
Right.
And but now Black Pete has been banned.
Yeah.
And we now have Rainbow Pete. So you're actually not that far with the
really?
price.
Yeah.
He's a rainbow. So actually,
what a surprise! Yeah, but you are right. It's like I view it as a kind of cultural imperialism from America, where
yes,
it's
inverted imperialism, where we take over all the guilt complex.
Yeah, we willingly take in the sins of America and ascribe them to ourselves. It's like no.
Yeah.
Like I mean, for example, like I as an Englishman, I'm really proud of the way that England dealt with slavery. Obviously, especially legally when a slave, I can't remember the name of the slave now, but he escaped on English soil, and so it went to court, and it was just declared, well, the air of England is just too pure for a slave to breathe, he's free. And that was how English law decided that slavery just wasn't permitted in England. And that was in 1750 or something. And I'm just sat there going, well, right, so I'm actually really proud of that, actually, and I think that was the right thing to do. And now I get to hear about America's sins about slavery, and I'm supposed to, because my skin is light, I'm supposed to take this on myself. It's like, no, we have a tradition about slavery and we're against it.
And also the implication or the suggestion that every white person was a slaveholder.
Oh, God.
And every black person was was a slave.
Yeah.
It was ancestors were slaves.
It's not true.
Or that there were no black slave traders.
Slaveholders.
Or was no...
or slaveholders.
Yeah,
there
or
were
owners,
actually,
yes, exactly, of course.
Danish de Souza wrote a book about this. I didn't know this. It's completely wiped from American history, but there were
plenty
black slaveholders in the USA.
Right.
But it's now it's recreated into this sort of every white person is guilty, every black person is a victim, and it uproots society completely. It puts us against each other. During the COVID period, I also discovered that there are so many values that we share with Muslim communities, Muslims, and that there are obviously fundamental issues about immigration. There are issues with regards to social participation, and there's a cultural discussion there to what extent we want our nations to become more ethnically and culturally diverse and so on and so forth. But when it comes to values, traditional values, there's a common ground that's very strong. And the way in which we've been accepting all these little pockets where, oh no, I'm this, I'm that, that is also something that has been created because we are being called racist all the time, so much that it's like, oh well, yeah, it's not really true, but hey, there's an element of truth there or something like that. Therefore, we have the Muslims, we have this, we have that, we have the conservatives. No, we have to break free from that. That's a force that is very strong. I think if the conservative elements within the immigrant communities link up with traditional European conservatives, it's very interesting. The Conservative Alliance, it's called in the Netherlands sometimes. I mean, I see there are still a lot of problems, but it's also...
It would be better to have at least some solidarity with these communities.
Yeah.
Because in many ways, you're exactly right. But one thing I notice is that a lot of these people do not think of themselves in the way that the left thinks of them. The left thinks in abstract categoricals. And these
They
people
are victims. We must subsidize
or
them.
they're black, they're gay, or whatever. But these people think of themselves as being on a kind of sort of the river of civilization.
Yes.
You know, they're the inheritors of the Islamic tradition and things like this. And so this is a much more rich way of looking at the world. And actually, they respect us more when we view ourselves in that way as well. You know, if they say, well, hang on a second, we're the Christian Europeans, then suddenly we have a majesty in their own imagination and a self-respect about ourselves. When we just say, oh, we're white people, that doesn't mean anything to them as much as it doesn't mean anything to me. You know, I don't know what that means.
Or we're people. Yeah. We're individuals.
Yeah, exactly. That's even more reduced, you know. But if we frame ourselves as being a part of a great civilization, then they actually have some respect for that, because it comes with obligations, it comes with entitlements, it comes with expectations. I mean, one of the reasons,
but also something that we have a right to uphold, and something to radiate, to be proud of. If you talk to, what is someone who is coming into the Netherlands seeing of that culture? Very, very little. They see people being drunk in the street on Friday and Saturday nights. They see promiscuous sexuality. They see horrible architecture. They see just a very annoying sort of approach to immigrants, where there's like sort of us and them thinking. This polarized society. I wouldn't feel in awe for the greatness of Western Civ.
Yeah.
If I were coming here from, the Sahara, Sub-Sahara Africa, like, you have no idea what you're. But if the first thing you see is you visit a cathedral, you hear classical music, you get this society of pride people that are standing up for their families. That's a completely different experience.
But not just that, just view themselves as the bearers of a culture, the bearers of a civilization. And this is one thing I've noticed about the immigrants, is that they actually do view themselves very much as bearers of their own civilizations. Like the Indians become very Indian over here. The Muslims become very Muslim. They're very attentive to this. And one thing that I noticed when I was reading and studying the grooming gangs in the north of England was that one of the ways that the Muslims would demean the girls is by essentially treating them like bad Christians. They would expect these girls to, they would say, they're slags, they're unworthy, and they would expect them to be good Christians, and they're not. Modern English people basically aren't. And so that, when you think about it, they've come expecting crusaders, basically. They've come expecting, a mighty civilization of good, decent, virtuous people, and what they've found is actually profoundly disappointing, degraded, and not worthy of their respect. And so they have shown no respect. And I think, don't get me wrong, it's obviously the fault of the people who have committed the crimes that's happened, but it's also the fact that we have kind of been, in a way, letting ourselves down. If we actually had been speaking with full chest and saying, no, okay, you've come to England, that's fine. Here are the rules. This is how the English run England, and you should be aware of that. Have a great day. They would be a lot more respectful, a lot more understanding of where their place in the society is.
Definitely.
And it's just very disappointing to me as a person who finds himself adopting a mindset from previous centuries that actually this came to me so late in life. Right? I should have had this growing up, but instead I grew up in the 80s and 90s where, we're at the end of history now. You're an individual. Don't worry about it. Go and play video games. Go and smoke weed. Go and get drunk. It's like, hang on a second.
And so now you're only eating red meat. Pretty
much, actually. Yeah. I'm on the keto diet, so I am actually pretty much only eating red meat. But we were told not to take our civilization seriously, and so no one else has taken our civilization seriously, I think.
Yeah.
And that's really a problem, isn't it?
Yes, my friend.
I hate to do this, but I think we're going to have to end this now. So this went over a lot longer than I expected.
Why don't we do this again in a couple of weeks?
I would love to, because I've really enjoyed this conversation. I didn't realise it was going to get so deep so quickly, but I think it's great. So these are the sort of conversations I think Conservatives actually need to have. And you don't see anything like this on the television, which is a real shame. But thank you so much for joining me, gentlemen. I've really, really appreciated the conversation.
Thanks.
Thanks, folks. We'll see you next time.